Welcome to the Inside Sales Enablement Podcast. Where has the profession been? Where is it now? And where is it heading? What does it mean to you, your company, other functions, the market? Find out here. Join the founding father of the sales enablement profession, Scott Santucci, and trailblazer Brian Lambert as they take you behind the scenes of the birth of an industry. The Inside Sales Enablement Podcast starts now.
I'm Scott Santucci.
I'm Brian Lambert, and we are the Sales Enablement Insiders. Our podcast is for sales enablement leaders looking to elevate their function, expand their sphere of influence, and increase the span of control within their companies.
Together, Brian and I have worked on over 100 different kinds of sales enablement initiatives as analysts, consultants, or practitioners. We've learned the hard way, not hard day. See, this is all part of the process. We've learned the hard way what works and perhaps what's most importantly, what doesn't.
And our focus here on this podcast, Inside Sales Enablement, is on you as a sales enablement leader and orchestrator. As you know, sales enablement orchestrators have very specific characteristics, and I'm going to share those with you now. First of all, you're mission and goal focused. You've prioritized the right goals at the right moments. You guide the narrative by confronting reality to get the right stuff done. You drive results by design, not by effort. You unlock energy to create momentum, and you catalyze change through collaboration. Those are the 6 attributes of an orchestrator. And you can find out more about that on our earlier episode on orchestrators. As we usually do, we're going to start with a centering story on this particular episode. So Scott, what kind of centering story do you have for our audience today?
Well, I got a great one. So I first want us to dwell on how cool this name is, okay? And how awesome the Italians are at naming people.
Yeah, go figure, says the Italian.
Well, I don't have Scott as an Italian name. Like I just have the last, I'm half right. But listen to this name, Vilfredo Pareto.
Oh,
it's
nice.
Poetic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very nice. Okay, I've properly dwelled on that, so let's move on.
It's very elegant. So who is this person and why are we talking about him? But as many of you may know, you might know this idea of the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule is also called Pareto analysis or Pareto distribution, or he's got a lot of other things. And many people call him the father of microeconomics. So if you look at economic theory like Adam Smith and you read it, it sounds like, oh, this is like a sociology book. And then when you look at, or a philosophical book, when you look at Pareto's works, it looks more modern. He's got tons and tons of tables and statistics and things in there. And one of the things that he really observed is in trying to figure out distribution of power and where power really resides, he was caught up in a lot of the revolutions in Europe during the time. So let's frame it out. He was born in 1848 and died in 1923. So you can imagine there's a lot of turmoil. And he's Italian. So if you know about Italian history, they started the process of revolutions after the Civil War in the United States, so the 1860s and on. And making these observations about getting in big problems and arguments with the governments, the local governments, about what things needed to do, because he was a very, very much a laissez-faire or classic liberal in those senses. Not what we would call today a liberal. Definitely, if we called him today, he'd probably be very conservative or probably a libertarian. But the key observation that he made that was so groundbreaking was that he found that 80% of the wealth, or not so much the wealth, but 80% of the land owned in Italy was owned by 20% of the population. And he had to keep double checking that. And what he found is that pattern is a reoccurring pattern. And you've heard us talk about that pattern before in some of the other podcasts that we've done, because we found that pattern exists with salespeople. About 20% of the salespeople are generating 80% of the new growth. About 20% of your customers are generating 80% of your profits. All of these things work. And we have Vilfredo Pareto, again, the poetic name to thank.
Thank
So that's our
you.
centering story.
Thank you, Vilfredo Pareto. I just wanted to say that.
I'm on the Vilfredo Pareto fan club.
So I got to ask, Scott, and our listeners do too. So what?
So what?
Does this have to do with sales enablement?
So what this has to do with sales enablement and our topic today is that there's one of the things that we tend to do and drive a lot of costs is we do a lot of activity. We do lots and lots and lots of stuff. But a lot of stuff, are we doing the right things? And how do we figure out, there's always a mathematical element if we embrace it. Most of us don't embrace these things because it's just far too easier to say, well, let's go fix the sales force. Instead of saying, let's find the 20% of the sales force to improve. And what can we do? And really what we're talking about here is the introduction of systems thinking. And when we talk about that, as you all on our show have adopted that you want to be orchestrators, part of what we're trying to do is highlight the business value of being an orchestrator or the business problems that we're looking to solve. So that's why this matters so much, this centering story. And the topic that we're going to do is, so what is systems thinking? Is it some new age idea that we have to have a crystal and hug trees over? Or is it something real and something tangible?
Yeah, I love that. And to help us with this today, we've got an expert in the space joining us. His name is Jerry Brightman. He is a bright man, so we're going to have him help us with this topic. Yeah, you got him. I do too. And Jerry's a great guy. I've learned a lot from him over the last 20 years. I met him when I was first coming out of the military, and he was in program and project management. He's done some great, fascinating work in industry all over the world. He's been to 100 different countries. But right now, in his phase of what he's doing, he's a professor at Tufts and at Harvard. And Jerry, one of the things that I was reconnecting with you around was I saw on LinkedIn you had posted this really cool post about teaching this really interesting class to folks at Harvard. And that class was on systems thinking. So I reached out and I said, hey, our listeners are asking about this. They're also, quite frankly, pushing back on Scott and I a little bit around some of the topics and wrestling with them. And I said, let's get Jerry on and let's ask him some questions that perhaps our listeners might have and explore this topic of systems thinking. So Jerry Brightman, thanks so much for joining us here on Insider Nation.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You bet. Can you share a little bit about your background that maybe I've missed?
Well, it's a very diverse background, but it does have a way of connecting dots. I started out as a very young guy who went to school seemingly forever, getting an undergraduate, an MBA, and then even a DBA, Doctor of Business Administration, and then guess what? Teaching at a university, and out in Western Michigan University in the wilds of Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I was asked to teach an off-campus course in Grand Rapids to real live working business people in that area. And it was very quickly known to me in the moment that I was a fake. The only advantage I had over these people who were working all day and going from an MBA in the evening was they were actually doing business. And I had an advantage of being one chapter ahead in the book. And I realized that I love the teaching. I really love being in front of students, graduate students, real practitioners of business every day. But if I was going to be helpful to them, I had to quit teaching and get into the business world. And I was very fortunate to join a global chemical company for about a dozen years that wound up being the very first company ever to do business in the People's Republic of China. And during that period of time, I was very lucky, along with my CEO, to be pioneers in the trade with China, being the very first to go to China. And without any knowledge of the country, of its history, of its culture, of its ways of negotiating, even its currency and contracts, we wound up doing $1 billion worth of two-way trade with China, a country we didn't know at all. And so what were the tools of our trade? And one big one was thinking more systemically about the work we were doing.
Excellent. So to kick us off, I'm going to ask you two pretty basic, straightforward questions. And I'd like some, basic, straightforward answers from you, Jerry. So the first question I want to ask is systems thinking, is that a thing?
I wish it were more of a thing. I think that real leaders around the world would benefit systems thinking as an addition to their toolkit, especially in the areas of decision making and seeing the broader interrelationships and interconnections of their own work staff and their own people and the people that they try to do business with. So it's very real. It's just not seen by many people, quite honestly.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing you say is that it's a very real thing. Just a lot of people aren't taking advantage of it.
And frankly speaking, it's not unlike the quality movement years ago, which was a real thing. And however, people picked the low-hanging fruit, expected great results, and didn't do the work behind it to make it real. So,
well, and also too, wasn't that true that it was a real thing in Japan, and it wasn't a real thing in the United States, and our auto manufactured cars got slaughtered, and then they adopted it.
Well, Dr. Deming was preaching loud and clearly in the United States, and people didn't listen to him. Yep. So he said, "The hell with you guys! I'm off to Japan." And those folks loved it, embraced it, and that's why the Japanese car makers for over a decade were such a fierce competitor to the United States. And but we expect quick results. We're a country that wants quick results, and I think systems thinking, similar to the quality movement, is somewhat counterintuitive. It takes time to implement. It takes time to understand it, and it does work miracles in our sense of we ignorant people going to China for the first time, knowing nothing, doing $1 billion worth of two-way trade in a wide range of areas, and even developing our own consulting firm that helped American and European firms understand what the China business was all about.
So I love that. So that gives me my second sort of blunt instrument question. My second question is, so if systems thinking is a thing, what is it? What is it? What is this stuff? What is systems thinking?
Yeah, there's a very great quote by Albert Einstein. So I want to bring in Einstein to prove that I'm a professor, right? So you can't do better than quoting Albert Einstein, right? And Einstein says that the problems we face today cannot be solved with the same level of thinking that existed when the problem began. Time has gone very quickly from the start of that problem to the present time. So what Einstein is saying, pretty simply and down to earth, is we've got to change the level of thinking that we have today to deal with that older chronic issue. And systems thinking is a wonderful, wonderful way to do that. The big thing that executives have to do is they have to change their thinking. They have to change where they're coming from, change their level of thinking, just like they had to do with the quality movement. And, let's face it, habits are hard to break. I've got young kids who still have habits that they started when they were 4 years old, 3 years old. So habits are tough to break. If they can break the habits and open up their minds to new ways of thinking, systems thinking will be a valuable tool to their leadership. Guaranteed.
So are you saying systems thinking is like a mindset thing? Why don't I do yoga, or why don't I do meditation? What do you mean, man?
I'm not going to quote Einstein anymore, but My buddies at a corporation that I worked for a number of years had a very interesting word called metanoia, which is the definition of metanoia is shift of mind. So yeah, they don't necessarily have to do yoga, but you won't believe this, but I start all my Harvard classes with the required reading called The Miracle of Mindfulness by Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Vietnamese monk nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize then by Martin Luther King. And mindfulness is just understanding the world around you and being truly present. It's not way out. It's just a consciousness of what's happening around you. And for some reason, I usually get classes of 30 people from 18 to 20 countries, ranging from Europe and the former Eastern Europe to China and Asia to Latin America, and it seems to be a common thread. It attracts them to the idea of systems thinking. They have to be present, which they are both in the class, and when they leave me, I keep in touch with them for many years. It connects the diversity of people to a common way of thinking, which is systems thinking that we do in our class.
So I'm going to ask or challenge you a little bit here. I'm trying to channel some of our maybe more traditional thinkers in our audience. And I'm putting myself in the situation advocating for systems thinking. I would get, see, it's just crystals and healing. That's what all yoga is. How would we describe it to be more concrete? And what do you teach your students in your class? Like in your class that you go through, I love that you're starting out with, hey, you got to be more open-minded to be able to embrace some of these concepts. And I like that you brought up counterintuitive. But what's the meat on the other side of all the counterintuition? A lot of people just don't like all that anxiety or ambiguity of getting to the point.
But what they don't like more than that are the chronic issues that they face in their everyday business world. And when I say chronic problems, I mean problems that they thought they had solutions for, that 6 months later come back and rear their ugly head. And the reason for that is the busy pace of business today, and it's going to be even busier tomorrow, is executives think like managers. They have to-do lists. And the greatest achievement of their day is knocking off their to-do list, right, and go to tomorrow. So quick fix becomes a very valuable a tool in their repertoire. However, and actually quick fix has a good place in systems thinking. However, it doesn't get to the root of the problems. And that's why 6 months later, these chronic problems come back and bite them in the leg, and they're stuck. Why? We had a great solution for it. Well, you didn't have a great solution. You had a quick fix that knocked it off your to-do list, and now you got to come back to it. So
just kick the can down the road.
Kick the can down the road. So the attraction to not only my students but my clients is, so you're going to sell me a bill of goods, maybe. All right, let's be cynics here.
Yeah.
You're going to sell me a bill of goods that's going to get my chronic problem solved so it stays solved. And I look them straight in the eye, maybe from the back of a snake oil wagon. I don't know.
I think we should adopt like it's a yoga studio. You're in the back of a yoga studio teaching me how to yeah, exactly. Kumbaya. You're going to make me stretch.
It ain't, but it's going to make your chronic problem go away. And so here's the deal. Here's the way your audience is working today around the world, no matter who your clients are. They're working at 3 levels. One is at an event level. And so if you picture an iceberg, okay? So picture an iceberg in your mind. The very tip of the iceberg is working at an event level. So I ask my clients and my students, how many of you are problem solvers or put out fires? And 90% of the hands go up, and they say 90% of their time is occupied putting out fires and solving problems. So I, of course, play the jerk in the room, right? And I say, so let me get this straight. You're sitting in your office, twiddling your thumbs, waiting for the phone to ring with a problem. And then you can jump and be that problem solver. Or you have your fire extinguisher ready to go and put out the fire. And by the way, one of my friends once said, beware of firefighters. They become arsonists. They set fires to show how good they are putting them out. So I say, how much of your time is spent firefighting and putting out problems? 90%. And let me ask you a question. Is this reactive or proactive? Oh, it's reactive. You have to have the problem first. So let me, your clients, your people who are listening to this podcast are saying, well, wait a minute. We're good people. We've learned how to put out the fires and solve problems. You're saying that that's not good? I'm saying, no, we need problem solvers. We need firefighters. But you're spending 90% of your time doing that. What a waste of time, of talent, right? So let's get to the next level on this iceberg at the water level. And that's what we call trends or patterns. So let's say, for example, that the last 5 years, we were short of our widgets in October, November, December. And next year, because we're so brilliant, we're going to make more widgets in January, February, and March to solve that problem at the end of the year. Is that proactive or reactive? And here's where the class goes, it's really reactive as well, because who's to say that the next year, year 6, is going to be the same as year 5? And if we did it during the oil crisis, we budgeted for $1 a gallon of oil and said, all right, we're going to be really smart. In the 6th year, we're going to budget $1.25, and it goes to $5. you're dead meat, right? So now that's another 5%. So 95% of the world today is reactive. Systems thinking goes beneath the level of the water into what we call the structural level. And I could spend an hour talking about structural elements, but I'll limit it to things like hiring, firing, what's our vision, where are we going? And one of the most insidious structural elements in any organization are the mental models or assumptions that we have about our customers and about ourselves. And most of the time we're fooling ourselves. We don't do the work to find out who they are. And that's the beauty of systems thinking. Those things that are in the structural level in any organization that you guys do work for or consult for, they have rules about how we hire, how we fire, who gets a raise and who gets a bonus and who goes where. And we think that they were made by a higher power. But the fact of the matter is they were made by human beings. And if human beings developed these structures and made these structures, human beings can change them. But they're spending 95% of their time reacting, whereas the level beneath the level of the water at the structural level is proactive, and that's where the leader lives.
Yeah, I love that. And Jerry, so on that, building off of that, you're hinting at that there's structural elements, and also we've got this idea of perspective and mindset, and you're also outlining that there is this proactive side where leaders could probably and should probably be spending their time. So does systems thinking help there? And then if so, is it an approach, like a strategic approach, or is it like a science? Is systems thinking a science?
Yeah, so one quick visit back to that image of the iceberg. And you're right, Brian, that's where the leader lives. And the deeper he or she goes down in that iceberg, the more leadership leverage they have. So is it a science? Peter Senge, an MIT professor who wrote a phenomenal book on systems thinking called The Fifth Discipline. And, you know, Brian, a good management book, a bestseller, is one that sells 10,000 copies. Senge's book has sold well over 1 million copies. And
after you read that book, you'll never think about rubber bands the same way again.
You got it.
So tell us about that. So you're hinting at that it's a science. What are some of the scientific components of systems thinking?
So what I would call scientific components, and there is a very quantitative element of systems thinking that gets into computer modeling. And I don't go there, but I will say, instead of scientific components, I will use the word archetypes. And an archetype definition is a common story. So wouldn't it be great to have a common story or an archetype that fits all products, all countries, all technologies in the same box? And people in my classes look at me, okay, you're crazy. Now you're selling the snake oil again. So let me give you one archetype of maybe 20 or 30 archetypes that I use all the time. But I'm going to start with a quick story, if you will allow me to tell a quick story. Is it okay?
Absolutely. We love stories.
All right. So you're watching CNN, and for the first time in 3 months, instead of talking about the pandemic, they have another tragic story. And you're watching Wolf Blitzer talk about starvation in Somalia, right? And on day one, he turns it over to his reporter in the field. And what do you see? Brian and Scott, jump in. You're going to be my students for a minute.
They're going to see starving kids in Somalia, or Africa. Yeah.
So the
reporter breathe life
says,
into it, make it real.
Yeah. So what he says is Wolf, we've got a terrible problem here, and the camera pans all around the reporter. And what do you see in the image on CNN at that moment about starvation?
Starving people.
And what do starving people look like?
They have bugs on them.
They have bugs on them.
Very skinny.
They're very skinny, but fat bellies. They're begging. They have their hands out this way.
Exactly.
Sad. Very sad.
How do you feel when you see that image?
I feel sad, and I want to donate money.
So that's terrific. Day 2, Wolf Blitzer still is not talking about the pandemic first. He's talking about Somalia. But we see something different on the screen on day 2. What do we see? We see people, men and women in suits, in front of microphones saying, this cannot be allowed to stand. We, the rest of the world, are going to bail out Somalia. On day 3, what do you see?
Helicopters.
The UN is there giving out stuff.
That's right. You see planes going into Somalia. You don't get too cynical and talk about food riots quite yet, but you see the food being delivered. you see happy faces. And now, Scott, how do you feel versus how you felt 3 days ago?
Way better. I'm ready for my next story.
We can check that off the list and move on.
Exactly. So what do you see on day 4 based on that comment, Mr. Brian?
The next one.
You see nothing. You go back.
See nothing on this one. Yeah.
Problem solved.
Problem solved. Yeah.
Check it off your to-do list.
Yeah.
6 months later, you're tuning in and it's still talk about the pandemic, but Wolf interrupts and says, guess what, folks? Starvation in Somalia. So.
But wait, doesn't he need like Bono to advocate it first?
Right. Yeah.
I hear the music.
Four people, Clooney.
Right.
So now let's go back to this notion of archetypes. So I'm going to put that story that I just told you in an archetype, a very simple archetype. So picture for a moment 3 boxes, one kind of on top of the other, okay, on the left, with one box way to the right. And we're going to start with the middle box, and we're going to call it problem symptom in 3 words or less. So come on, Scott. I know you're good with words, but think of 3 words or less that will describe that situation in Somalia.
Desperate.
That's good. So no, that's fine. Desperate or starvation in Somalia, 3 words or less. Now let's go to the box above that, which is called quick fix. And what happened during the quick fix? What happened in the story?
Helicopters.
We sent in helicopters and planes with excess food. A wonderful humanitarian. Scott, you felt very happy when you saw that happening.
Yes.
But wait a minute. In this archetype, or the science, however you want to call it, Brian, I'm good with any term you want to use as long as it works. Now on the right-hand side, we've got unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. Wait a minute. Jerry, you're telling me there's unintended consequences of this wonderful humanitarian act? Well, guess what? There are. And what may they be? You guys are bright. You can be in my Harvard class next week.
Well, you put a Band-Aid on it, and you haven't fixed the food shortage. You just put a Band-Aid on it. So
people with guns show up and kit all the food.
Yeah.
And they ration it out. And then they have a power base.
And you can eat one day, but what about the other 364?
Yeah, Brian, you're heading to the 4th box.
I'm sorry. I'm running ahead of class.
I'm sorry. You're shooting hard for the A in the class. I know you. I met you before. So you're not getting the A quite yet. You got to stop at unintended consequences. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to see if you can really ace this quiz, right? So question number 1, what happens if you're a farmer in Somalia and all the food is coming in for free?
Oh, yeah, well, you're out of business or you don't have a market.
Yeah, so do what you go where your brother, your cousins, your uncles go, and you go into the city. So what about the drought or the starvation next time with fewer farmers?
Yeah, it's worse.
It's worse, right?
Definitely worse, yeah.
So now you got a multiplier effect, right? What about the price of food in Somalia when it goes down? Because the food coming in is for free, right? So anyone in a marketplace trying to sell food, they're out of business too because the food is coming in for free. So now, Brian, to get the A in the course, I'm going to go to the 4th box. And the 4th box is fundamental choice. Now, I'm betting Scott and Brian are not agronomists or work for the Women in Development or Areas in Development or AID, Agency for International Development. But what do you think would be a more fundamental choice to the allusion, Brian, that you were giving to the biblical saying, give a man a fish and he's not hungry for that day. Teach him to fish and he'll never go hungry.
For a lifetime, yeah.
Yeah. So
that's what you want to do is you want to, and there are some organizations that do figure out how to make the food supply work in that situation, but it's a long-term play.
Exactly. So, Scott, we could throw out a lot of ideas now. We could say bring in a wonderful irrigation system, a modern irrigation system from the U.S. or from Europe or from Israel, whatever. We could say let's bring in insect repellent seeds. Let's move the population. All right, now we're getting into real policy issues and so forth. But here's the beauty of this archetype and the heart of systems thinking, right? Brian, you're absolutely right. We put a Band-Aid on it. That's for the quick fix. But I said earlier, the quick fix, let's not dismiss it so quickly. And I want you to listen very carefully to these words. I've said them so many times, they're scripted in my brain. So forgive me for being Dr. Brightman for a minute, but let me say it anyway. The quick fix in service of the fundamental choice is a good thing, because in that short period of time that we bought through the quick fix, we saved lives, right? We haven't done anything yet to change the structure at that system, at that structural system below the surface of the iceberg. We've done nothing. But we have brought in food and supplies to help people from starving. So the quick fix in service of the fundamental choice, a good thing.
Yeah.
However, the flip side of that is every time we default to the quick fix, we atrophy the potential to ever use a fundamental choice. And that's the problem with leadership today. The quick fix in a complex world works because the problem's gone. At least we think so for 5 or 6 months until it rears its head in being a chronic issue. And so the 2 points of leadership versus management, and there is a difference, right? If you look at that second box, the quick fix, that's where the managers excel. And that's where project managers excel. They're terrific because in a very short period of time, they've got to figure out where the excess food is in the United States and around the world. They've got to bring in those helicopters and planes. And they do it masterfully, right? They find out who's going to pay for the gasoline. They get the invoices out, and those planes go to solve that problem within a day or two, right? It's fabulous. But the problem still exists, and that's where it becomes a leadership issue, right? At the bottom of those 4 squares, the fundamental, that's where the leader lives, right? And he or she is not in the spotlight anymore. They've got to do the tough things. They've got to figure out the long-term budgets. They have to think about how do we change the government. That's why we have to figure out our supply chain. Are we making food in the wrong places in this country? Maybe we have to move the people. Maybe some people have to die. These are matters of life and death. So the managers live in the quick fix. The leaders live in trying to decide the fundamental choices. So is it a science? In a way, you might want to call it a science, because this archetype that even though I gave you the story of starvation in Somalia, you give me a chronic problem, and I swear I can use this archetype to come to a fundamental choice and a solution that gets rid of that chronic issue for the long term, so it stays solved. And that's my speech for today.
Yeah, appreciate it. So this is great, and I love the mental model, right? That's one of the concepts that you introduced here is there's a mental model approach that you can take to these complex problems, and also you're connecting a lot of dots, right? This idea of leadership, what's the difference between leadership and management? We call that being heroic, and we have some podcasts around that. We also have this idea of analysis versus synthesis, where in system thinking, you're connecting a lot of dots. You're synthesizing all these things into the best possible decision, whereas analysis is about breaking these things apart. We had that on an earlier podcast as well. So in that, for our listeners, Jerry, what would you say they need to do in order to understand this a bit more and start applying it in what is a sales and marketing complex problem, much like what you've outlined here today?
Well, you know that again, Brian, you raised a wonderful term that I love, because it causes a lot of problems and it can get us out of problems, which is mental models, right? The folks that you're dealing with have an idea of what sales is and what marketing is. And when I started in my business career, I was facing 3 tremendous competitors, Roman Haas, Bayer, and Sumitomo, who made the same exact product that I did. So I figured, by dint of my wonderful personality and my minimal knowledge of the chemistry and science behind this, I'm going to go to the marketplace and defeat these 3 giants. And I didn't. I failed miserably because of the mental model that I had about marketing and sales. And the difference between marketing and sales is sales starts with a product. That's exactly where I started. And I said, our product is terrific. And my customers in Latin America and throughout Asia said, can you give me a lower price? No, I couldn't. It was a commodity. Can you send it to us any faster? No, it goes by ship. Is it more effective? It was a herbicide for rice. Does it kill the rice better? No. And then the fourth and most impressive question was, why the hell do we need you? And I started thinking after my fourth or fifth failure in my fourth or fifth country that, the academic womb ain't a very bad place after all, and I'm going to go back to teaching. Except, I think by the sixth country I went to, I began to lose my voice. So instead of using my mouth, I used my ears, and I began to listen. And people told me different ways to change the packaging of the product, to present the product, to ship it faster. And my customers gave me the best ideas ever to compete with Roman Haas, Sumitomo, and Bayer. And I learned the difference between marketing and selling was that selling started with a product, whereas marketing started with a customer. And I became a hero. And I defeated those three giants in this giant David and Goliath kind of scenario. So again, the clients that you have, that I have, we've got to question their mental models, their assumptions about how they're actually marketing their products or selling their products, and the difference that exists between them. And I think systems thinking can do that too. It challenges your assumptions. And I used to work at the Center for Creative Leadership. They just came out with a brand new study a month ago saying the key to fabulous and successful leadership is self-awareness. And none of us, and I say this in front of my class with all humility, none of you guys and me, your esteemed professor, are as self-aware as we need to be. Secondly, another discipline that he talks about is coming up with a shared vision. And too many companies have beautiful murals in their waiting room, in their offices, that they spend $20,000 worth. The fish are our customers, and here's the ecosystem. It's BS. We have to come up with a vision that's real. And it's not what the vision is, it's what the vision does. And that's essential to any good business. We talk about teamwork, and we have all these funky things. We go out to the woods, and that's not what it is. How do we learn together? And I use as learning the synonym create. How do we create together? And that was our secret to success in terms of China. We met every morning at 8 o'clock to all the communications that came out overnight. And we dove into those problems systemically. We had answers to our colleagues back in China who are on a 12-hour time difference, and they became heroes. We became heroes through the work of learning in teams, challenging and changing our mental models. And your job as a leader is to surface what's the origin of that assumption and to make it less of a hindrance in your work. And that's why I said all this work around systems thinking is it goes against the grain. We want answers quickly. And that's going to be one of the that's going to be a mental model right there, Brian, that's going to trip us all up in our work. We checked off all the things on our to-do list. We're done. We're heroes. We're not. We haven't gotten to the biblical thing that you talked about before about teaching people to fish rather than just eating a fish for a day.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. Self-awareness, shared vision, creating together, challenging mental models.
And then systems thinking. Systems thinking wraps them all up together.
Gotcha. Well, Jerry, that's amazing. I appreciate you bringing us into class on this podcast and understanding the actual attributes or what it looks like to be a little bit more holistic and engineered in our approach to these complex challenges. Right. I used to say to people, and they didn't like me saying it, but I said, look, the challenges that we have right now are more complex and complicated than they were in the past. A lot of the easier problems have been solved. It's now really about leadership and tackling some of these broader systemic issues that you may be inclined to say, look, it's not my job. Well, to Scott's point on the webinars that he often has is, well, if not you, then who else? Who's going to do it?
Let me just interrupt one last thing, Brian. You are so spot on. Again, my buddies at the Center for Creative Leadership just came out with another study that said the days are gone when we can go to our HR professional and say, what book should I read next? What class should I take?
You're right.
Where should I? And so the HR people are saying, you got to figure it out for yourself. So the question then becomes, how do I know what I don't know? And that's where people get stuck. And one great direction that I urge you guys as consultants to do is have them think a little bit more about systems thinking. They will become the leaders of their organization if they embrace this as not the end all and be all. I don't want to sell it this way, but I want to say it's an adjunct to all the other decision-making tools you have, because none of the problems, I used to fight with the Project Management Institute, the PMI, the PMBOK guide. They always say lessons from experience, right? the only problem I have with that is, who's to say that the problem you're working on now is identical to the lessons you've learned from the prior project? And it may be just totally different. So that's why you've got to look at the structural issues that are impeding your progress in project management and in your consulting work.
Yeah, I love that. Now we're going to have you back on another episode to talk about these, because I think this has been great, and we actually may get some listeners on to ask the professor some more. This has been a good introduction to this. I know a little bit about this topic, and I find it fascinating myself. And one of the things that I would encourage our listeners to do, much like you just talked about, Jerry, is you don't know what you don't know. So exploring these topics is critical. That's one of the purposes of this show, is to broaden horizons and expand perspective, and also really confront our own internal biases that we may have. If the first reaction is to discount this type of topic after listening to these stories and listening to the impact that this can have, then this perhaps isn't the show for you. You might be listening to the wrong podcast. This is about tackling root cause issues and being an orchestrator that drives value in your organization. And if not you, then who else is going to do it, right? So, Jerry, thanks so much for your time. On behalf of Scott, we both really appreciate you coming on the show today. We'd love to have you back in the near future, and look forward to seeing you out there on LinkedIn some more. And everybody listening, make sure you go add Jerry to your network, and we'll see you guys out there. And if you have any other questions, hit us up on engage@insidese.com, and we appreciate your time. Jerry, thanks.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. To become an insider and amplify your journey, make sure you've subscribed to our show. If you have an idea for what Scott and Brian can cover in a future podcast, or have a story to share, please email them at engage@insidese.com. You can also connect with them online by going to insidese.com, following them on Twitter, or sending them a LinkedIn request.